Dear participants, welcome to a very special session on New Zealand South Asia ties with Suzannah Jessep, Director Research and Engagement of Asia New Zealand Foundation. Suzannah Jessep joined the foundation in March 2019 after serving as New Zealand's Deputy High Commissioner to India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and Deputy Ambassador to Nepal and the New Zealand's Deputy High Commissioner to Vanuatu. During her 13 years in the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and Trade, she also served in the Ministry of Australia, Pacific and European Division and in the area of Antarctic and security policy. She is a board member of the New Zealand Institute of International Affairs and sits on the advisory board of Minister Damien O'Connor, Trade for All Ministerial Advisory Group and New Zealand Contemporary China Research Centre and the New Zealand-India Research Institute. Suzannah is passionate about Asia and in particular building New Zealand's connection with the fast-growing and dynamic South Asia. Ms. Jessep, welcome to our program. The program is streaming on our Facebook page and several others such as our media partner CoverHub. Ms. Jessep, the first question for today is, what are New Zealand's foreign policy priorities? How do you look at New Zealand's foreign policy?
Well, thank you so much for having me, Pramod, for this opportunity today to connect. It's really great to be joining you, and congratulations to Denise for running such great programs. Well, on New Zealand foreign policy, New Zealand's typically prided itself on being an engaged player, guided by the principle that if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. So in normal times, not in the midst of a pandemic, you could expect us to exhibit sort of classic small state behaviour, active multilateralism, working with others, balancing powers and interests, using soft power and so on. But, with COVID, much of this has been thrown upside down. I think it's fair to say we're far more insular and introspective. And we've become more focused on our immediate neighbourhood, particularly the South Pacific. And here our priority is just to be a good partner, in bilateral terms, keep trade ticking over. We've got a development program of around $1.3 billion over 3 years, and through offering assistance with health support with COVID. I guess the other factor that shapes New Zealand foreign policy is our status as a maritime nation. We've got the 4th largest EEZ globally, no land borders, all our trade goes by sea. And so we're very attentive to the rules and laws that govern the sea, such as UNCLOS. Maybe the third factor that shapes our foreign policy is New Zealand's current leadership, which brings quite a different flavour to New Zealand foreign policy than what we've seen in the past. Prime Minister Ardern is a young female leader who's got a very different style of politics to her predecessors, and much of her communication to the New Zealand general public has been around kindness and equity and community wellbeing, which has been quite different to, say, John Key and his market-driven approach, and certainly contrasts in tone quite a bit to, say, Australia's Scott Morrison. It's the same for Nanaia Mahuta, our foreign minister, who has brought a real focus on Māori values and bringing in an Indigenous lens to foreign policy, which I think your institute has recently explored. But the degree to which these things really changed the direction of New Zealand foreign policy, I'm not so sure. I think it's more a matter of style and tone rather than any significant policy shift. But day-to-day terms right now, New Zealand foreign policy is focused on combating COVID. We've got a very aggressive elimination strategy with quite short, sharp lockdowns. We've got pretty much closed borders. And now we're just working on getting vaccination rates up and then on rebuilding and reconnecting. We're also hosting APEC this year, which has all been online, unfortunately. But it's involved a tremendous amount of energy from our foreign ministry. And I don't think New Zealand is under any delusions that APEC is a perfect body, but we do see it as an investment in public good and a body that helps sort of grow the pieces that might form new formal architecture for the Asia Pacific. But yeah, overall, I'd say that if geography is destiny, and when under stress countries revert to their instincts, then New Zealand has reverted to it, which is to be an island among islands. And I mean, I don't think this is a particularly good thing, but I think this is the reality of New Zealand foreign policy right now.
Ms. Jessep, what is your view on the rise of emerging Asia and how does New Zealand perceive it?
New Zealand's definitely been in the camp of welcoming the rise of Asia. You know, the Asia New Zealand Foundation, where I work, we were established in 1994 specifically because we recognised the importance of Asia and the need to invest more in learning about Asia and doing more together. More recently, however, in the last 10 years or so, we've become a little more cautious about the rise of superpowers within Asia, particularly China, because experience has taught us that our values don't wholly align, and because of the impacts of those superpowers can have on the rules and regional order that, you know, small dependent countries like Nepal and New Zealand depend on. So it's made New Zealand more wary and more selective. But I think it's true for most countries at the moment. You know, we're all learning to compete and cooperate simultaneously. Government relations aside, I think public perception has also played a role here. For the last 25 years, we've run a longitudinal study looking at New Zealanders' perceptions of Asia. And in our latest study, which was released in June, we found that while a greater number of New Zealanders consider Asia to be important now than any other time in the previous 25 years, and this is despite the pandemic playing out, that perceptions of China's friendliness toward New Zealand have notably deteriorated, with I believe it was a 14% drop between 2019 and 2020, to the extent that for the first time ever, more New Zealanders said they saw China as a threat than a friend. And this is reflective of Kiwis, you know, basically not liking what they see of wolf warrior diplomacy and things like state-sponsored cyber attacks affecting the services they use, and headlines about human rights violations, and more recently hostage diplomacy and incursions in sovereign territory and so on. At the same time, the survey asked New Zealanders, you know, which countries in Asia New Zealand should invest more energy and time to manage. And second on the list was China. So in some ways, we're a bit of an odd case. We know the China relationship is difficult, and we know it's going to be hard to manage, but we still want to engage. More broadly, we saw a marked increase in the friendliness of many, the perceived friendliness of many South and Southeast Asian countries, particularly Vietnam and India. So there's some rebalancing and reorientation going on in terms of our perceptions of the rise of Asia. But overall, I think it's fair to say we remain very connected. And this has got to be a good thing for New Zealand. And, you know, 7 out of 10 of our top 10 trading partners are in Asia. I believe 1 in 6 New Zealanders are of Asian heritage and so on. So I think that sort of integration is borne out by the stats.
Ms. Jessep, Asia Pacific has long been the focus of New Zealand's diplomacy, strategy and trade. How does New Zealand see South Asia in terms of pursuing its engagement in the region? Does New Zealand recognize the importance of South Asia as an economic partner and its growing political significance?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really interesting question, Pramod, and something that I've been quite actively engaged in. My own view is that New Zealand doesn't know enough about South Asia. It's been, you know, too far off the radar. We've rested a lot of our engagement on positive, easy connections born out of our shared Commonwealth heritage. In long-standing people connections like we've discussed with Tenzing Norgay and Ed Hillary that have then been carried forward by others. But I don't think we've really figured out how to be an effective small partners when trade isn't at the heart of our engagement. Because for New Zealand, I mean, one thing is true, that trade has been at the heart of our foreign policy and building connections. And often, you know, it's been that we've agreed a trade deal. Once it's been achieved, then all the other doors are open for other investments and initiatives. And this has worked well across Asia for us, and it's been very successful, but trade isn't really at the heart of what's been achieved in South Asia. Our relationships are warm and sort of long-standing, but a bit thin, in my view. And because of this thinness, and if we can call it that, I think media headlines disproportionately shape the public's impressions. And because of the way media is sort of operating, this typically hasn't been favourable to the region. You know, we see disasters and terror attacks, extreme events, but we're not hearing about the innovations and the positive developments and the other things that really bring us together. But I think this is changing, you know, as is the trading world itself. There's a strong sense in New Zealand that time of big, high ambition capsule trade deals might be waning, and that the ease of doing business and the ease of diplomacy is becoming much harder. And the pandemic's obviously had a massive impact here, but it just also reflects today's geopolitics. And in New Zealand's case, this has meant we've moved to more bespoke initiatives that might not achieve everything we want in a trade sense, but that might weave in environmental standards or gender inequity standards, or maintain the supply of essential goods during COVID and so on. So ultimately, you know, even if our trade relationships are put aside, whatever form these trade relationships take, there's no question that South Asia matters to New Zealand. And we know South Asia is going to be consequential. I just don't think we've quite landed on what great looks like yet. But, you know, this is something that my foundation and I in particular are working to explore right now.
After serving for years as New Zealand's Deputy High Commissioner to India, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh, and as the Deputy Ambassador to Nepal, how do you see New Zealand's engagement in South Asia?
Yeah, well, there's no shortage of goodwill, but we are limited by our size and resourcing. So I think we're always having to think creatively and strategically about how we can build the right kind of relations. And with COVID and closed borders, you know, there's no question that it's been harder to sustain relations. But when we look to the world today and to global dynamics, you know, I think we've got a lot to discuss. Countries like Nepal and New Zealand have strong vested interests in maintaining a rules-based global order. We've both got interests in peace and stability and resolving disputes peacefully. Both have equities in WTO and multilateral organisations. You know, we both want to ensure countries respect the sovereignty of others. We both want to ensure small and middle powers have a say, and it's not just a sort of might is right world. And I think we each have very real interests in developing our people and economies so that they're equipped to operate in a world that's less certain and less stable and less predictable. So I think there's no question that we have shared interests, but the main question is how do we do this today effectively? And I know New Zealand will be very interested in South Asia and Nepal in particular's thoughts on this.
As a former Deputy Ambassador to Nepal, how do you assess Nepal-New Zealand relations throughout the years?
I think they've been strongly people-based and really shaped by the achievements of specific individuals like Tenzing Norgay and NZIRI, and then the subsequent formation of, say, the Himalayan Trust and the various initiatives led by its members and supporters. Here in New Zealand, we have the achievements of the Nepali diaspora, like those who lead the New Zealand Nepal Society. And many of these connections have created positive legacy across various fields. And we've got our students too, who have gone on to do great things in both countries. But, you know, while we don't have reciprocal high commissions in Kathmandu and Wellington, we do have wonderful honorary consuls with a real sense of goodwill and trust between us. So, yeah, I mean, it's warm, but, you know, we could be doing a lot more.
Ms. Jessep, in what ways can New Zealand and Nepal work together in promoting economic ties between the two countries?
Yeah, it's a good question. At the moment, I think COVID's dominating everything. New Zealand's got closed borders, and much of our energy is just domestic, you know, keeping people employed, keeping supply chains functional. But as we recover, I think there's no question that New Zealand will be looking to South Asia to continue to grow and diversify its economic relationships, including with countries like Nepal. An area that sort of, when you ask that question, that jumps out at me is probably tourism. And I mean, I know it's an area we've worked at in the past, but as services sector has been hit so hard, it seems like a good area that we could work together to really look at regrowing and sharing expertise around ecotourism and adventure tourism, and sharing know-how for sort of best practice and sustainable practice. But yeah, let's see.
Ms. Jessep, thousands of Nepali students go to study abroad, and US, UK, Australia are favorite destinations, and I'm sure they'll be willing to study in New Zealand as well. So what would be your suggestion to Nepali students planning to study in New Zealand?
Well, I mean, I don't like to say this, but my advice would be to wait. I mean, I would wish we had students coming now, but unfortunately, it's a little too early to contemplate studying in New Zealand because of the elimination strategy that we have and pretty much hermetically sealed borders. I know, even New Zealand citizens are struggling to be let in. I think we've got something like 31,000 New Zealanders on a list waiting to get access to managed quarantine facilities. So it's quite intensive at the moment. On the flip side, it's also meant we've only had 4,000 odd COVID cases and fewer than 30 deaths. But we haven't quite figured out those systems yet for how to get students in, for how to ensure that they're looked after safely, how to house everyone safely. So it's a little slow going, but I know universities themselves are really exploring options and looking at postgraduate hybrid degrees where the final year is done in New Zealand. But of course, this only works for some disciplines. So for now, wait, but I would hope to bring better news over the coming months.
Ms. Jessep, you just mentioned about COVID. So how is New Zealand coping with the COVID-19 pandemic? How can New Zealand support Nepal in the fight against the pandemic?
Yeah, so New Zealand's doing pretty well, but it is on the basis of having a very small population. I think we've got ridiculously high levels of trust in the government, so that meaning that we follow advice and we're very compliant. There haven't been protests here, and the government's also been taking on debt to keep businesses afloat and jobs going and so on. But because we've kept the virus numbers low, our economy is also doing quite well. I believe it's growing at 2.8%. And in fact, yesterday I saw global rating agency S&P singled out New Zealand as one of the better performing economies in the Asia Pacific. And I think only one of two that are growing faster than expected alongside Singapore. But certainly the challenge for us now is that we need to start to open up, and the community is divided on whether we should be doing this. Some want us to achieve very high vaccination rates before we do, and others want the doors open tomorrow. So, vaccinations are happening, but I think we're at around 35 to 40% of our population who are eligible. Only a little way ahead, Nepal's 20-odd%. So we've still got a way to go there. In terms of working together, New Zealand has been working in the COVAX group. I believe we gave an extra, which was 17-odd million, and an extra $1 million to Nepal when you were going through the last terrible spike. We have been working with other governments, sharing the government's public communications and some of the visuals that I believe the World Health Organization's also taken up to help explain the pandemic and how it's tracking to the community. There's been quite a bit of collaboration within our region with Taiwan and Singapore and Vietnam and others who have shared their expertise and data. But I think fundamentally Delta seems like a bit of a game changer in terms of transmission. So it's now really all about vaccination rates and helping each other get to as high as possible vaccination rates. And then looking at, I think New Zealand would be very interested in how Nepal is going as it facilitates tourists and new arrivals at the moment. And we would, very greatly learn from the experiences Nepal takes from that. And likewise, I'm sure New Zealand would be very happy to share any experiences or insights it has.
Ms. Jessep, the fall of Afghanistan government and rise of Taliban is a global concern. What does the fall of Afghanistan mean to New Zealand?
Well, I mean, we're a long way away from Afghanistan, but there's no doubt it's been distressing. I don't think there's any country that wants to see, its efforts evaporate so quickly. And the speed at which the Taliban took over, and the messaging coming from the Taliban, particularly related to the rights of Afghanistan's women and children, I think was pretty alarming for New Zealand. The New Zealand Defence Force was able to get hundreds of our people out, but also hundreds remained. So like others, we're now looking at what we can do work with others to get those people out. And in terms of our government, I think we do worry that the situation in Afghanistan and Taliban rule, what that means for regional security, for stability, for the war on terror, for the rights of Afghanistan's citizens who would otherwise sort of shape Afghanistan's future. So I'd have to say it's probably a big step back on almost every front.
China is one of the emerging powers in South Asia. Balancing China is one of the major challenges of almost all the South Asian countries. How is New Zealand engaging with China?
Yeah, I would describe New Zealand as being in the same predicament as most others. We've got very strong trade relationship, but there's certainly aspects of CCP behaviour that worry us deeply from a security and sort of regional order perspective. New Zealand's approach has been to try to keep the relationship functional. So we've spoken up when we see the CCP do something we don't support or endorse, but we try to keep the other parts of the relationship intact. And the Ardern government said that it aims to be sort of consistent so that we're predictable. And this seems to be premised on the idea that we'll try to not be the one that rocks the boat, that we'll try to manage issues together in good faith. But I would say it's done in the full knowledge that ultimately we know it might not be our choice when the relationship deteriorates, or if it does. As others have seen, it's often the CCP who decides unilaterally when it wants to show its sort of displeasure with the country, as we've seen with Australia. In talking to Australian colleagues, they've also highlighted that ultimately the deterioration in the relationship came down to values, which are not easy to sort of reconcile if they're fundamentally different. So there's no simple patch up to get back to business. And these are the differences that sort of, we would see as quite deep-seated. So we're a little wary, but we are trying to manage the relationship without heat. But I don't think we're under any illusion that it might not be our turn next. And I guess, the last thing to say would maybe that, if things do deteriorate, we don't have any hard power to project. So whatever happens, we're going to be managing it through diplomacy and partnering with others.
Suzannah Jessep, thank you so much for your time. It was a pleasure talking to you.
Lovely to be here, and thanks so much for hosting me.